Hello and welcome to the first lecture for this Michigan history class. Today we'll address Michigan statehood and Michigan's involvement with the Civil War. A few themes will be addressed in this presentation. First of all, by the end of it, you should be able to identify several key figures, including Stevens T. Mason, Robert Lewis, and William Faulkner. Also, you should be able to understand Michigan's involvement in the history of the death penalty in our state. Lastly, we'll explore Michigan and the Civil War. The first topic is to study some of the steps that led to Michigan statehood. This map identifies the original 13 states and territories. You're probably familiar with the states along the Atlantic Ocean. They were 13 colonies, then they declared their independence and became states. Well, U.S. territory actually extended all the way to the Mississippi River, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Here we see a close-up of what was referred to as Northwest Territory, where the arrow is pointing. That's our state, Michigan. Michigan was not an original state, but it was part of U.S. territory as a result of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. In the years following the American Revolution, a small number of settlers began to slowly settle into what is now Michigan. Well, by 1835, there were a fair number of people who were living in Michigan, and so the territory applied for statehood. But Michigan did not become a state for another 2 years because of what historians have come to call the Toledo War. This was a war between residents of Michigan Territory and the state of Ohio. So what did they fight over? Well, essentially, the city of Toledo. Notice the odd border where the arrow is pointing on this map. Notice it's not straight. I'll show another map here in a second. They fought over the pink area here on this map. That was referred to as the Toledo Strip. This was just under 500 square miles that both the territory of Michigan claimed and the state of Ohio claimed. So why the heck were they fighting over Toledo? Well, it was believed at the time that the city of Toledo would eventually emerge as a key trading port and transportation hub or center for the Great Lakes. You can see its location here on this map where the arrow is pointing. Let me offer just a bit of background. First of all, the state of Ohio had claimed Toledo when it entered the Union in 1805. However, the territory of Michigan had always administered affairs. For example, they had collected taxes. The state of Michigan, or the territory of Michigan, had been collecting taxes. Well, when Michigan applied for statehood, with Toledo as part of Michigan and not Ohio, Ohio officials objected strongly. Next, I'd like to identify a few leading personalities. The first is shown here. This is Stevens T. Mason, the boy governor of Michigan in the 1830s. He mobilized Michigan's militia to fight in order to keep control over Toledo. Here we see a map of Michigan's counties. Notice the arrow is pointing to Mason County, where West Shore Community College is located. Mason County is named for Stevens T. Mason. The leading personality in Ohio was Robert Lucas. He was the governor of Ohio, and his goal throughout the entire process was to preserve Ohio's claim. He mobilized Ohio's forces to fight against the Michigan militia. Well, there was a lot of anger back and forth, but there was also one battle, the so-called Battle of Phillips Corners. As an Ohio survey crew was trying to remark the boundary line in favor of Ohio, Michigan's residents shot a few bullets at this crew. Eventually, there was only one casualty of the Toledo War. It was B.F. Stickney, who was stuck in the leg with a penknife. However, he didn't die, but he was injured in this skirmish. Now, the president at the time was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson recognized that Michigan had the better legal claim. However, Ohio was a state, and states had more political power. At the time, Michigan was a territory, and it had one non-voting member of the House of Representatives. The state of Ohio was large. It had 16 members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators. They lobbied Andrew Jackson to try to find a compromise to this issue. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Ohio received Toledo and the 468 square miles of that Toledo Strip. Because people recognized that Michigan really did have the better claim, Michigan did receive territory, the western half of the Upper Peninsula, and this was 900 square miles. Most people at the time thought that Ohio had won. Well, in the long run, as a result of all of the minerals and everything in the UP, Michigan probably won out handily in this conflict. Again, here's the map that was shown earlier. The arrow is pointing to Toledo, and the belief at the time was that Toledo would become the better transportation hub or center. But eventually what happened is that Chicago, the city that's circled here, emerged as the better port city and the key city for transporting goods and people and all sorts of items throughout the Great Lakes. Now, there was one additional result of the Toledo War. As the tension grew between the Michigan residents and Ohioans, the Ohio citizens declared that Michigan had a bunch of people who were as fierce as Wolverines, and that tension between Michigan's residents and those from Ohio continue to this day. Next, I'd like to explore the unique history of Michigan and the death penalty. I'd like to start off with a little bit of background. In the 1820s, a young woman who was from Canada, from Windsor, Ontario, was raped and murdered in Detroit. I don't know how well you know Michigan's geography, and particularly Detroit. Windsor is a city right across the Detroit River from the city of Detroit. The police explored a range of different suspects, but eventually they focused their attention on Patrick Fitzpatrick, who eventually was arrested, he was tried, and convicted of the young woman's rape and murder. Soon thereafter, he was executed. He was hanged. But the story doesn't end there. About 7 years later, Fitzpatrick's former roommate was dying of tuberculosis. On his deathbed, he confessed to that crime. Officials realized that they had not only arrested, but they had executed the wrong man. This led to a tremendous outcry throughout the state of Michigan, and in 1847, Michigan became the first state in the Union, and probably the first of any English-speaking territory in the world, to abolish the death penalty. Next, I'd like to explore Michigan's involvement with the Civil War. On the left, we see the governor of Michigan, Austin Blair, who's often referred to as Michigan's Civil War governor because he was the governor for most of American involvement in the Civil War. Just to provide a little bit of background to the state of Michigan, it was fairly large. It was the 10th largest state with about 750,000 people in 1860. Overall, residents strongly supported the Union, and over 90,000 men served in the armed forces during the war for the Union Army. Here we see 2 individuals who served in Michigan regiments. Do you recognize the guy on the left? That's George Armstrong Custer, who later would gain fame fighting Native Americans in the West. On the right, we see Frank Thompson, who was born as Sarah Emmon Edmonds. You're probably saying to yourself, how did a woman get in the United States Army? Well, she wore a disguise. She passed herself off as a man, Frank Thompson. And in 1862, she passed the Army's physical because they didn't explore a person's body. Instead, they just asked a series of questions. Initially, she was employed as a nurse, and then she became a spy. During the war, she contracted malaria, and because she knew that she would end up in a military hospital, she deserted from the armed forces. In the years after the war, she got married, She raised 3 sons, and she wrote a book about her experiences. By the 1880s, her story was explored, and she received an honorable discharge as well as a pension from the United States government. You know, sometimes the truth can be stranger than fiction. If we look back at the status of Michigan on the eve of the Civil War, Michigan was dominated by the Republican Party, and overwhelmingly its residents were against slavery. Here we see Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was popular in the state of Michigan, and he won the state in the election of 1860. Um, on the left, you see a poster of Abraham Lincoln and his vice presidential running mate, Hannibal Hamlin. Lincoln's popularity was pretty strong locally here in West Michigan. A small lake was named for Abraham Lincoln and a river that led to that lake, as well as another lake that's out at the state park, Lake Hamlin. And so those were both named in honor of President Lincoln and his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. The local lumber baron and politician Charles Mears pushed through the name changes for the lakes and the rivers bearing Lincoln's and Hamlin's name. If you're from the Mears area, well, that area is named for Charles Mears and the state park located at Pentwater. We'll explore more of Charles Mears' activities in a little bit. Many of you have probably heard of the Underground Railroad. This was a collection of safe houses in southern states and then eventually leading into the northern states, which helped many slaves obtain their freedom. Michigan was an important stop on the Underground Railroad, particularly the city of Detroit, because of its proximity to Windsor and Canada, where slavery was prohibited. Battle Creek was another key area in the Underground Railroad, and on the left here we see Sojourner Truth, who was an escaped slave who fought for women's rights as well as the rights of African Americans, who eventually moved to Battle Creek and lived there for many years until her death. Although Michigan's residents were strong opponents of slavery, this didn't mean that they supported racial equality. In fact, the city of Detroit was described by one historian as a so-called democratic island surrounded by a sea of republicanism. And this was probably the area where Lincoln was least popular. The Detroit Free Press was a leading newspaper even back in the 1800s. Several articles appeared at the beginning of the Civil War that reflected the racial attitudes of many of the residents of Detroit. Here we see one. Our fathers declared that they, the white race, the Anglo-Saxon race, were free and equal. Clearly, this has an anti-black or a white supremacist message to it. Here we see some additional passages from the Detroit Free Press. In the first, we see the goal of some that argue that the Civil War should be about preserving the dignity of Northern labor, as opposed to freeing the slaves. In the second, we see that freed slaves are compared to the locusts of Egypt, and slaves are referred to as plantation savages. Overall, in Michigan, support for the war and emancipation of slaves was strong. However, in the Detroit area, you saw a different attitude on the part of many of its residents. They saw freedom for the slaves as competition for the jobs that many of them wanted. Just as the Detroit Free Press was publishing those articles and playing on people's emotions and focusing on the racial attitudes that people had, Congress took action and implemented, for the first time in American history, a draft. Legislation creating the draft was formally called the Enrollment Act, and it became law in 1863. All men between the ages of 20 and 45 were subject to the draft. However, you could escape the draft if you were drafted if you hired a substitute to serve in your place. The other way that you could avoid service was to pay $300 to the government. Several men took advantage of this, and as much as $600,000 was paid by men from the state of Michigan who were drafted in order to avoid their service. The passage of the Enrollment Act, which came about at approximately the same time that the Detroit Free Press was playing on people's racial fears, brought a lot of anger to the residents, the white residents of Detroit. And many argued, hey, this war, this fight against the South, well, this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. If you're rich, you don't have to actually serve and put your life on the line. Poor people are going to get stuck fighting in order to free slaves. And they were upset. The tension between Detroit's white residents, who were upset about the draft, and members of the African American community led to a race riot in the city of Detroit during the Civil War. The spark for this race riot was started when William Faulkner, a so-called mulatto tavern keeper, was arrested because he was accused of raping 2 white girls. Mobs of whites ended up rioting when he was transferred from his cell in a jail to the courthouse one day. Eventually, 2 blacks were murdered, scores were beaten, as many as 35 buildings were destroyed, and about 200 blacks and a handful of whites ended up homeless as a result of the destruction and the fire that broke out, as that was sparked by this belief that William Faulkner had raped these 2 girls. The riots themselves took place over 2 days in early March of 1863. A few years later, the 2 girls who had accused William Faulkner of raping them admitted that they lied on the stand. Almost immediately, Faulkner received a pardon from the governor, and he later received money from local businessmen who pooled their resources so that he could establish his own business. This was important because the race riot of 1863 foreshadowed a lot of the racial conflict that would eventually occur in the city of Detroit in future years. Unfortunately, this was the first of 3 major race riots in the city. I will place a video clip on Canvas that identifies some of the highlights of this race riot in the city of Detroit. It was just a horrible event. I'd like to end the lecture with a few final comments. Today, I tried to explore some key events and individuals that shaped the steps that resulted in Michigan statehood, and eventually some of the highlights of the Toledo War. Secondly, hopefully you can now answer the question, well, how or why is it that Michigan does not employ the death penalty? Lastly, I explored some of the topics involved with the Civil War in the state of Michigan, as well as the racial conflict within the city of Detroit. That's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, and we'll see you online. Have a great day, everybody.